Okay, Ana.
Então, boa noite.
So, good evening to all of you who are in Brazil. Good morning to everyone in Australia. It is a pleasure to have this very special group in this theme of educational policies for the prevention to gender-based violence. In this having you this morning, this is our third webinar of a series of discussions of this larger exchange project between Brazil and Australia in gender violence. This is a project that is held by the Public Prosecutor's Office of Brasilia and together with the UniCeuB University and with the support of the Australian Embassy in Brazil. We have a very significant list of institutions, both Brazilian and Australians, that are partners of this project. So tonight, we'll have the presence of different Brazilian and Australian specialists, and we're going to go dive deep into the trends both in Brazil and Australia with regards to educational policies to prevent gender-based violence. So for the coordination of the works of tonight, we're going to have Gisela Lopes Gomes Pinto Ferreira, or Dear Gisele, my friend for many years, partner in different projects in this exchange. And Gisela, she currently is a doctorate student of the Queen's University of Technology. She has a master's degree by that very institution. And I've had the pleasure to collaborate in the context with the different interviews. One important reference that we have in Brazil in this educational policies to prevent gender-based violence. Gisela has an amazing resume, and I won't go too much into details, but certainly to how well she's going to mediate the event, we'll know the excellence of her research. So I pass the floor to Gisela. She will introduce our speakers for tonight, and she will lead the works. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tiago. It's an honor to be here with you. Before starting, I just want to have the acknowledgement of a country. I'll do it in English, but then I'll go back to Portuguese, as we have set up, not to confuse the interpreters.
The Turrbal and Uagara as the First Nations owners of the lands where QT now stands. I pay my respect to the elders, lores, customs, and creation spirits. I recognize that these lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. Agora, eu tenho a honra de convidar a professora emérita.
And now I have the honor to invite Professor Haley from the University. Professor Helen, you have the floor.
Well, hello to everyone. Good evening, good morning. I would like to speak with you about some work that I've been leading both in Australia and in the Asia-Pacific region around the prevention of gender-based violence through work in schools. So I will share my presentation with you on the screen. So there's two examples I will share with you today. One is about the Connect with Respect program. This was commissioned by UNESCO, and I will be sharing data with you from trial of this program in Asia Pacific and East and Southern Africa. And then closer to home for me in Australia, in my state of Victoria, the Resilience, Rights and Respectful Relationships program provided by our Department of Education, and I will share some implementation data from that. I'm the lead author of both of these programs, and with my team at the university also had the chance to research the impact. So firstly, Connect with Respect was originally developed for the Asia Pacific, but later UNESCO took it to further development. But first, some background, what is this program? It's a program for junior high school and senior primary school. It has these parts that you see described here. Part one is on understanding gender and gender equality, where we look at gender equality and positive role models. Part 2, we talk about prevention of gender-based violence, raising awareness, what is gender-based violence, and how can we respond positively in schools. And part 3 is the skills for respectful relationships, how to communicate, how to support people affected by violence, how to help seek and provide peer support. So in combination, this program has some social and emotional learning teaching in it and some focus on prevention of gender-based violence. After the Asia Pacific development, UNESCO funded consultation in the East and Southern Africa region with multiple countries seeking to find out if the program could be adapted and made useful in those settings. So we took a strong focus through participatory consultation on checking and refining for cultural ownership, the language, the scenarios, the examples. So the program was modified, and then we had a pilot of the program in 6 countries, looking to see the factors that affect implementation, the impact of the program on student attitudes, relationships, and behaviour, and also collecting data from teachers and students about the value of the program. So overall, with these 6 countries, our trial took place mostly in 2020, but some across 2019. Different UN agencies supported the trial in these countries: Eswatini, Zambia, Tanzania in East and Southern Africa, Thailand, Vietnam, and Timor-Leste in Asia and Pacific area. We collected a big data set, over 9,000 students in survey pre and post, nearly 800 students in focus groups at end of the program, and over 300 interviews with teachers about the experience of implementation. There were challenges in rolling out the program during the time of the pandemic, especially. And so some countries were not able to teach the program in full due to school closures, but we all understand these impacts. I'll share a little of the findings. They were very promising. Firstly, the students themselves, very much highly recommend. Survey, over 90% of students said all schools should teach about prevention of gender-based violence. Very strong student voice. More than 2 in 3 students found that doing the program improved their relationship skills with their peers. They could see each other more as equal, says one student. There has been improvement in the way we relate in class, says another. So students also describing a more friendly classroom as a result of this program. At the end of the program, students also made recommendations about which parts of the program they found most useful. Learning about human rights was number 1, the human rights of equality for males and females. Understanding the effects of gender-based violence on those who are victimised. Learning how to communicate about their emotions, how to get help for people affected by violence, and how to avoid joining in when bullying and harassment took place. And students recommend that Connect with Respect become part of the curriculum, just like their other subjects. Other data we collected showed things like reduced rates of sexualized touching and harassment in most of the schools. Some students reported that they learned how to change their behaviour, and they saw some changes in their peers' behaviour. We also saw a big increase in knowledge of how to get help if someone is affected by violence, and a big increase in intention to seek help for themselves if they were affected by gender-based violence. Some of the focus group data gave us a better understanding, particularly one student saying that we've learned that gender-based violence, we should not suffer in silence. Many of the students reported that it wasn't until they did the program that they understood these things should not happen to them. So learning about their rights was very important. We collected data also from the teachers about things that helped them and the barriers to implementation. So teacher voice is also strong in our findings. To summarize the things that were useful to enable their program was the school giving time in the school timetable for them to teach it. The training they had, they received a 5-day training. The program manual and resources, they have the step-by-step manual in the Connect with Respect manual. They understood from the students as they taught the program that the students were interested and they needed this program. But very importantly also, where they had support from their colleagues and their leaders at the system and school level, that was also important. But underneath it all, the teachers themselves had a commitment to this social justice issue. They believed in it. The barriers were really significant. Not enough time in the school week, in the curriculum, is the biggest barrier. Also, teachers reported challenge managing the student behaviour because the program uses participatory methods. Students have to work with each other in the learning activities. And in some cases, the workload, big classes, in some countries, classes of 90 students in Tanzania, because of recent move for free secondary education in that country. But also, of course, the cultural beliefs and traditions around gender roles were also a barrier. But overall, their recommendation was provide this to everyone. Provide the training and resourcing to support the teachers and make sure you have school leaders and peer support in the school. Where possible, give smaller class sizes, we can understand that, and engage the support of parents and community. In Australia, the program I'm reporting on is called Resilience, Rights and Respectful Relationships. This is a program with teacher manuals to guide the program at every level of the school, from foundation, where children age 5, through to final years of schooling, years 11, 12 for us, when students in Australia age 17 to 18 years. It has 8 core topic areas, which we teach at every level of the program. The first 6 are what you would think of as social and emotional skills, emotions, character strengths, coping and stress management skills, problem solving and help-seeking skills, then work on gender, gender equality, gender identity. And in topic 8, positive gender relations, we focus on prevention of all forms of gender-based violence. So the Victorian government in Australia provides the program, but they also provide training to help schools with their whole school approach with policy and practices, as well as classroom program teaching. And they provide the resource for all their teachers, open access. We did an implementation study with 20 primary schools and 20 secondary schools. The biggest barriers for teachers to use the program was lack of time in the curriculum, same as the biggest barrier in Asia and Africa context. Also, lack of access to professional training for enough teachers, the low confidence to deal with sensitive topics, particularly relating to gender violence, sexual violence, and family violence, and again, managing the student behaviour. The teachers found the biggest challenges for themselves in 3 areas. I call it pedagogical labour, or teaching the collaborative learning methods when they were not used to teaching this way. Emotional labour, worry about upsetting the students who have been victimised with troubling material in the classroom. And this last one, political labour, dealing with community resistance and backlash. The training they found most useful, right at the top there, is sampling the learning activities. Teachers needed to do the same learning that the students needed to do because they never had this learning. So that was the top most useful training tool. And then the things that most helped with implementation, similar to the Asia and Africa context, leadership support #1 for these teachers from their school system and the school policy, the training, the classroom program that showed you how to teach on these topics, and then the positive responses from the students, and again, their commitment to student wellbeing. So this, in summary, is 2 programs with some very similar findings. I will hand over to you now. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, professora Helen.
Thank you so much, Professor Helen. Your presentation was very inspiring, and certainly I see many commonalities with what I saw in my research and the recommendations by people working with the same theme in Brazil, and we have similar challenges, so I think we're going to have a very rich debate. Thank you so much. Now I will invite Maria Delaine, who is a researcher in the Research Center about Impact. She's an activist, so take it away, Maria.
Hi, Gisela. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. Just share my screen. Would you be able to enable my share screening, please? I can't seem to share it.
Só minutinho.
Just a second.
Just need the screen sharing enabled, if possible. Okay. Here we go. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to zoom a little bit back. Thank you for that presentation, Helen. I'm just going to zoom a little bit back and look at the bigger picture of primary prevention of violence against women in Australia, the background and the framework that's being currently used. A little reflection on respectful relationships education, some more about resistance and change and communities of practice, which is the project I've been very pleased to be involved with lately. So the primary prevention of violence against women in Australia, of course, is in response to the high prevalence of violence in this country. Men are more likely to experience violence, as well as women, from another male and at the hands of a stranger and in a public place, which is, of course, different from where women are more likely to experience violence, which is from a male at the hands of a current or former partner and in a private place. So women's experience of intimate partner violence are also more serious, with a higher risk and more likely to elicit fear, anxiety as a result of emotional violence. And the types of violence against women, of course, not just physical, cultural, social, financial, sexual, emotional, and spiritual or psychological as well. And the work is based, of course, on the sociological, ecological model of gendered violence, which, of course, places the structures and norms and practices of our society and institutions at the top. And gender equality, of course, is the broader goal. So all of these forces, systemic forces, organisational forces, reduce the equity and increase the violence of different forms. So the framework that was developed by Our Watch, which is the organisation that's tasked with driving change in Australia, from which government draws its guidance, looks at the 4 gender drivers of violence against women: condoning violence against women, men's control of decision-making and limits to women's independence, stereotyped constructions of masculinity and femininity, and disrespect towards women, and male peer relations that emphasise aggression. And then there's also supporting factors which are recognised and intersect with these. General support for violence, experience of and exposure to violence, weakening of pro-social behaviour, and especially the use of alcohol and other drugs, socioeconomic inequality and discrimination, and backlash factors which increase when male dominance, power and status is challenged. So they intersect with the gender drivers to increase the frequency and severity of violence. So the condoning of violence against women refers to a range of community attitudes and beliefs that downplay, trivialise and excuse and justify violence against women. For example, the idea that it's always excusable for men to use violence in certain circumstances. They can't always be held responsible, and some kinds of violence aren't particularly serious. Men's control of decision-making and limits to women's independence. Just have to look at who has power in the corridors of political decision-making. Male peer relations that emphasise aggression and disrespect towards women, that it's kind of normalised that young men will sexualise women and harass them sexually. And stereotyped constructions of masculinity and femininity, the boxes that we put girls and women and boys and men, and the expectations and assumptions that we impose upon them. And another key factor, of course, is further to the intersectional understanding of the gender drivers. So women face multiple forms of discrimination if they come from marginalised identity groups, higher rates of violence, and they're targeted more frequently. And Our Watch has provided some really great resources and graphics. So this one just indicates the different aspects of intersecting oppression and violence. And further to that, some of our work in various projects is really focused in on Indigenous perspectives, particularly around healing and decolonisation, and bringing this to the centre of the prevention of violence against work. So this model of decolonisation speaks to the intersection between the multiple drivers and how that increases the impacts on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. The ongoing impacts of colonisation are the background for non-Indigenous people as well as Indigenous people, and these intersect with the gendered factors that are emphasised in the current framework for the whole population. And along with this decolonisation framework, the Healing Foundation in Australia is also the peak organisation representing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and prevention of violence. So they propose a healing centred framework which requires creating safe spaces and healing places, identifying safe people, building strong cultural identities, learning about trauma and rebuilding our relationships and communities. And with regard to that, these are the key factors to achieve that. They're self-determination, control and leadership, cultural safety. We're trauma-informed, healing-focused, holistic. We prioritise and strengthen culture, use a strength-based and community approach. Intersectional factors are addressed, and non-Indigenous organisations work as allies in safe ways. And the key settings that all of this work can take place are all of them, from education and care, sports and leisure, in churches, through the arts, in workplaces, through the media, health, family, community services, advertising and entertainment, tertiary education, public spaces, and legal and justice contexts. So that's a background to the primary prevention of violence against women work. And with regard to respectful relationships, education is the focus on the school-based context. So it's the holistic approach and uses the education system for generational and cultural change. Our Watch designed a whole school approach model, which I'll go through briefly, starting with looking at the school cultural environment, structures, procedures, policies, and so forth that support gender equity, that leaders drive school-wide commitment and action. There is a high-quality professional learning strategy. It's recommended through our research and experience that at least 2 days, full days of professional learning are dedicated to gender equity and respectful relationships, along with ongoing support. Teaching and learning, the curriculum, community partnerships, DV, sexual assault, women's health agencies, organisations from outside the schools can support the schools with this work. And all staff and students who experience and perpetrate violence are also supported. And this approach needs these resources to be effective. Needs to address the drivers of gender-based violence, needs to have a long-term vision, approach and funding, a whole school approach, mechanisms for collaboration and coordinated effort, integrated evaluation and continual improvement, resources and support for teachers, and age-appropriate, interactive and participatory curriculum. So Helen gave a great summary of the Respectful Relationships program in Victoria. All states in Australia are creating respectful relationships curricula and endeavouring to provide support, learning support and ongoing support for their teachers. This particular curriculum is excellent. It's the one that I recommend to other states as an example of what a good curriculum looks like. And Our Watch has done quite a few different studies, including some pilot studies in primary schools with which I've been involved. And Our Watch provides extensive guidance, very detailed guidance on their website for respectful relationships education and how schools can, where they can find more resources and guidance. And the most important aspect, particularly from my perspective and my experience, is professional learning. This work cannot happen if teachers are not capable and well equipped and supported to do this work. And the critical reflection on your own ideas and your own beliefs and your own practice is the most important element of that, and to be supported in doing that in an ongoing way. So reflection on our own power, privilege and experiences, assumptions and prejudices requires courage and resilience. So just a little bit around the background and the rise of neoliberal government and the issues working in the system that's often resistant or hostile, where there's closed decision-making processes and silence and an atmosphere of fear. And I enjoyed reading Gisella's article, which covered some of that ground and some of what you're experiencing in Brazil. This is what we've experienced in Australia since this work started quite seriously around 15 years ago. But we'd also been doing this work 30 years ago in some parts of the country, before there was quite a backlash and a vacuum created. So the problem isn't just something to address in schools, it's certainly something that we need to work at from a systems perspective and looking at leadership in our bureaucracies. A lot of folk that I worked with and in my research on the feminist agency in these bureaucracies, people talk about being terribly traumatized by managing this work. So, so the community of practice aspect of this is how we get together to support each other as professionals, and we are able to look at these emotional dimensions of change and respond to that by coming together in safe groups to problem solve, to share our challenges and our problems, and build our confidence and solidarity at all levels. So the communities of practice that I was involved in running were for leaders of peak organisations managing violence prevention, and teachers in schools and community workers in sexual assault and domestic violence agencies came together. And the reports from these communities of practice were that the time spent together talking through what we've learned and what we've done was more valuable than the actual training. And folk are very enthusiastic about this. The emotional support was key. People enjoyed taking the time, meeting passionate people, learning from others, connecting with others, sharing ideas, improving, aligning with others, sharing ourselves, deep reflection, trusted environments, feeling like you belong. And as a growing workforce here in Australia and in Brazil, I think that this issue of sustaining the workforce, managing the emotional challenge of resistance and backlash, and building our community as a workforce and supporting each other and being supported by the leadership is key to primary prevention of violence against women. So thank you. I'll leave it at that. If anyone has any questions.
Muito obrigada, Maria.
Thank you so much, Maria, for your presentation. Your presentation was great to explain to the people here in Brazil what is our Watch's approach in Australia, which is the primary prevention agency in Australia. And I see that we have some common challenges, and I thought that everything you highlighted was very interesting, including the importance of the training of professionals, teachers, the staff of the school. And I think that this is also something that applies to what Professor Ingrid Leão does here in Brazil. I had the pleasure of meeting her in 2019. She has a master's and a doctorate in human rights in the University of São Paulo, and she's a professor in the State University of Mato Grosso do Sul. She's a feminist lawyer and a member of the Latin American and Caribbean Committee for the Defense of Human Rights. So we're going to leave all questions to the end. And I will now ask Professor Ingrid to give her presentation. And when she has 5 minutes left, I will let her know. And I will also let you know when your time is up. So you have the floor, Professor Ingrid. Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for this opportunity. I'd like to say hello to everyone. Thank you for being here. And on my part, I will talk a little bit about Brazil and give an overview of the situation of the educational policies so that we can broaden the scope of the dialogue between Brazil and Australia. I wanted to begin by talking about the Maria da Penha law in its 8th article, when it talks about the prevention of violence in the school curriculum. And the 8th article is very dear to our hearts, and it talks about the prevention of violence through changes in the curriculum within a gender, race, and ethnicity perspective. And this change, this gender, race, and ethnicity based change, this proposal not only prevents the violence addressed by Law Maria do Penha, but also gender-based violence within an entire project of society. And that's the first thing I wanted to say. And the second point that I will make is that in Brazil, we don't see public speeches saying that they're in favor of violence. We're not going to see anyone publicly say that I'm literally in favor of violence. We're going to see obstacles and procedures that are put in place which favor gender-based violence and make it harder to implement an education that prevents violence. Okay, so we see this very strongly in this current government, and I want to highlight that something that began in the government of President Dilma in 2011, which was when there was a change in a policy about the prevention of homophobia. And at that point, she ended up letting that be approved, saying that an educational material that had the goal of preventing homophobic violence could be debating sexual education. And her opponents used that episode and began using the gay kid expression. And from then onwards, in Brazil, the gay kid expression became very common, and teaching sexual education. And this became a huge problem in Brazil, to the point that the Brazilian president had to go to TV and say that in her government, she wouldn't accept sexually propaganda regarding sexual education.
Oi. Alô? E a ultradireita, ela...
And the right wing, well, they go before the changes, the government changes. So this is the first point that I wanted to bring. The barriers in education. Well, this is a very important year in 2021. That's when we started about the gay kit in Brazil. In 2014, this was a year of approval of educational plan. And then we started bringing this parliament, this gender ideology, we started bringing that to the parliament, that perhaps is well known in Australia, and it was well known in international instances, but it was not popular. And it was being popularized in the parliament with banners and everything. And with the fundament that speaking about or talking about gender and using this expression would be dangerous. It would be dangerous because it would be to talk about sexuality, or to teach sex, or would be leaving children unprotected. And this discourse also reverberated and also became a political statement in such a way that they wouldn't change whatever gender was there to sex, and besides this limitation, to try and find a criminalization of gender equality in schools. The criminalization of the gender debate actually in schools coming through laws that literally would ban gender debate or sexual education in schools. This is a path, and another extrajudicial movement where they would incentive the parents to send a letter to teachers and to schools saying that their children would not watch the activity A, B, or C at that school because they would not authorize it. So there was this movement at that very time, that very same time, and those two activities, they started being judicialized in Brazil. One part of those cases was judged by the Brazilian Supreme Court, the Brazilian Constitutional Court rather, and where the Brazilian court have said the obvious, that yes, you can talk about gender, it shouldn't be criminalized. And but there was a pending part of these trials that is still important to pacify this understanding, especially in election years like what we are having right now, and then where it's not in trend. So there was this new trend. The new trend is to make laws that would ban the neutral gender. Now, it's so you can't talk, you cannot say, well, using the different genders in Brazil. So we are in movements, a law that would ban the gender neutral, to use they in school, or it would be similar to they in English. Well, you know, at the very school, what does that impact in? That impact the freedom of speech, and it silences and this daily criminalization. So why am I going to make up a course or something interesting, or a secretary of education in a smaller city will create a nice program similar to this one that we heard today, and take that to a smaller city, and get in trouble, and hear the backlash of powerful people. So you start creating this type of circulation, so in this indirect fashion. So that movement has grown, and at the same time it has grown, the hate speech grew. The homophobia and lesbophobia has grown here in Brazil as well. And in this shortage, I have some time, and I just wanted to end by talking about two quick things. One, that we got closer to this theme with Guane, which is the organization I represent and I'm part of within this theme, because we started a campaign in 2009 called the non-sexist and non-discriminatory education, and that's why we got closer to, and we started monitoring these activities. That then it became a website called Gender and Education that is being managed by the Educational Action, and that became something a lot larger that you can certainly follow at Gender and Education, gendereducação.org.br, and we are part of a coalition that monitors the educational policies there. And the other point that I wanted to bring was what Professor Maria mentioned about decolonial education. Besides having the Maria da Penha that talks about education and gender, and the gender perspective, we have also laws in Brazil that talk about the African Brazilian culture, and a very important perspective of our education towards an anti-racist education that we don't talk a lot about anyway. So we don't have an integrated, holistic view of our education, or this nonviolence, of this gender and race, or a non-sexist or nor non-racist education, and we don't develop this view in an integrated fashion. And in this decolonial view that was what was presented by Professor Maria, this is what we also have. We have a strong tool, but we work with that separately. So in our practice, we end up working with these two tools, which is Maria da Penha law and the history of Africa and African Brazilian history separately. We have also tools to do so. Finally, I want to say that Brazil is at a very delicate moment, very difficult moment, and it's hard to talk about because we're a very rich, very beautiful country that changed a lot in the past 5 years, I'd say. It has changed royally, drastically. And it is even hard for us to tell you what public policies we have in place. We have normative, we have frameworks that for us are still very dear and we have projects and initiatives that are of utmost importance for us that we still need to recognize. But we are at a moment of a lot of vulnerability. That's what I wanted to bring. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Ingrid. It's always great to hear you and to see you talking about the challenges we have in our country. And if you haven't watched Professor Ingrid, she was amicus curiae in these cases, these very important cases, where this theme was discussed in Brazil. And it's great to watch and see the scope of her work academically and as an activist, always acting where we need. And we hope the winds of change will come this year. And it's quite clear that we still need, in this election year, we need to vote in people that put in the agenda as public policy the inclusion of the prevention of gender equality in the curriculum. This support must come from above or from top down because, from bottom up, a lot is happening. We still need the support from up high. So thank you, Professor Ingrid. I will now invite Marcos Francisco de Souza. He's a master in social policies by the University of Brasilia, social assistant, and he works at the Justice Court of Brasilia in territories for over 20 years. So Marcos, I believe we can give you the 20 minutes because everybody is still under the time. So thank you for the time. I will need it, definitely. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank you for the invitation in behalf of Dr. Tiago, who's representing the women, the gender, and sharing a bit of our experience. I'd like to thank our professors from Australia for being here with us to share their knowledge. Ana Paula, Maria Eduarda, Ingrid, and all the others. So first we're going to talk about, we'll talk about Maria da Penha Goes to School, and I will share my screen with you really quick. You can see me, right? So, okay. Well, apparently it's not possible. Can you see the slides? Well, yes, we can see the slide. But I don't know what's happening, but oh, there you go. So the Maria da Penha Goes to School program, it came, as Ingrid has mentioned, it came as one of the guidelines of the Maria da Penha law, Indent 5, that was the educational campaigns to prevent domestic and family violence against women, specifically for the school community, and also talking about the Maria da Penha law and the instruments of dissemination of that law. And we based on Paulo Freire, one of the biggest educators and researchers of education in Brazil, when he talks about he says that education alone does not transform reality, but without that, the change does not happen. And when he talks about that, he talks about a transforming model. So Paulo Freire tells us that both education and the school must be ways to train citizens that are critical of policies and they are aware of their rights. So as I represent an interdisciplinary team in the factory floor, as we call it, seeing couples and women under violence. So we notice that intergenerational education is something that comes from the Brazilian policy. So the children that suffer violence and they are at a violent home, they have a higher probability of reproducing this knowledge. So, so they are prone also, well, to be involved in interpersonal violence, in urban criminality, and the use of alcohol and other drugs. And besides that, the impact of the psychological and we know what violence has. Another impact is related to the very process of learning. So to be exposed and they're suffering domestic violence, this impacts their learning process. In the schools, they end up becoming the entry door for these situations. So if it's like the violence that comes from outside the schools, they end up appearing inside the school. So it was from these perspectives that we have designed the initial part of this Maria da Penha Goes to School project that became a program. So it was a program that was built from bottom up because we started going to schools, talking to teachers, and articulating with the regional learning institutions, bringing the partners to, and there was sensitivity and articulation meetings and defining as pilot experience the city of Ceilândia, which is the biggest city or biggest town in Brasilia, and it has a very large number of vulnerabilities, and especially domestic violence. And to have this pilot experience, we had an exploratory research with 370 people. Out of those, 90% said that it was important to take this Maria da Penha discussion, the violence against women and gender violence, gender-based violence, to schools. And from that exploratory research, that we had 3 thematic seminars with professionals from that city that was handpicked for the pilot experience, for us to get to know the reality of that school and have a survey of needs and expectations. And that was from these 3 thematic seminars involving other professionals of this network, other institutions, that we outlined the first draft of the Maria da Penha Goes to School. And then in 2016, in the first implementation, the first step that we'll talk in the first half of 2015, and then 2016, was signed a term of technical cooperation involving different institutions. I believe it was 8 participants back then, and that's when the project became a program. So what was the idea? Well, the idea was to make the school to be part of the community, and the community to get to know itself and go inside the schools. And so that was a proposal to work with themes in the human rights, especially under the framework of the Maria da Penha law. So that's when we noticed that the schools, they did not see themselves as part of this protection network to women and children in situation in violence. So the program had this role of integrating, of articulating the school and community, something that started back in 2014 and that still advanced up to today. And what were the challenges? Well, so first was to talk about the Maria da Penha law and to bring the network of guarantees of support to the education professionals, and to provide family education activities with the families, with the education institutions, and to contribute for the training of the education professionals under these themes, and support them in the implementation of pedagogical projects that can be cross-cutting with the gender and human right and protection line issues. And finally, to support the education professionals and the participants in this agreement in the help, especially the cases of sexual violence against women and adolescents that come to the knowledge of the school. So here in Brasilia, we have regional coordination. So I have 14 coordinations, and those regional coordinations, they are here to see to the 33 cities. And how did we define the steps of the project? Well, the first step was with the counselors and support teams. The second was with the school managers. The third with the teachers, and the fourth with the students themselves. And with the material of the program, we also brought the parents and caregivers. So because these professionals, they have as professional attributions within the school to support the students in their process, in their relationship with professors, uh, to bridge the school and the communities. And we have these professionals that they help after the violation of rights of students in the school. So for us, they were the entry door to talk about this project. So the school managers, we needed to have a sensitivity training because they are the ones who are responsible for the school, and they are our ultimate partners. We needed to have their support, to have the opening to propose actions, and the students and professors, for the teachers, or the teachers rather, to have support in their actions and the pedagogical processes and the collective projects that were directed towards gender-based violence and gender inequality and violence against women, and then Maria da Penha law. And the third step was the teachers, and we divided them by grade. Here in Brazil, we have the elementary school, the middle school, and high school. So the idea was to bring knowledge on gender-based discussions, and also to support these professionals in holding actions in this team based on on their disciplines, and to support these teachers in the identification and in the help and in the institutions, in the sheltering, and in situations that the teachers have seen in the classroom regarding the violation of rights in schools.
And the fourth stage is the students. Our goal was also to work with the students, themes related to the human rights of women and girls, how to develop healthy relationships, discuss among the boys, discuss masculinity with boys, and work with gender equality, help the students to identify and deconstruct the sexist macho notions of our society that become the breeding ground for several types of violence. So the themes that we defined with the educational coordinators, we had meetings before the pandemic up until 2019. We had in-person meetings with the coordinators and did a process of rapprochement with the regional teaching coordination, presented a project for that region, and I have participated in several meetings because I'm a part of this project ever since its inception. So depending on the regional coordinators, we had the participation of police officers from that city, uh, legal prosecutors, etc. This in the first meeting. In the second meeting, we talked about how to address sexual violence instances. And in the third meeting, we looked at the reality of that school, what were the most common types of violence. And based on that, we did a case study. And in that case study, we would invite other actors in the network, such as the social assistance department, the military police, to think about strategies for interventions. With the teachers, we divided by grade, and we did an awareness raising work about all of those themes. And then we had workshops in the schools according to the projects that were proposed with the teachers, by the teachers with the students, depending on the agenda of each school and the needs of each school. And with the students, we have been holding lectures, workshops, and seminars to address themes such as masculinity, gender equality, violence in relationships, and this came from a demand by the teachers, and we also created a sub-project within the umbrella of the Maria Penha in School program, innovative practices and contests. And from 2015 to 2019, even though we had very limited resources in in-person activities, we were able to reach over 16,000 participants just in the first stage of the project. And in the management committee, we created a management committee for the project, and it counts with a representation from each of the participants in the technical representatives. And in 2017, we had an addendum where we increased this committee, and currently we have 14 participants in this committee, and the creation of this committee aimed to deal with any issues related to the program, plan next steps, plan for new projects, and take advantage of the experience and the ideas of other participants. And in 2016, we had a partnership with the Training School for Education Professionals, and we created a hybrid course, 60-hour course geared to education professionals and professionals of the Women's Protection Network. And in 2018, we began designing a course in partnership with this same school on how to address gender violence within the school environment. And we're currently at the 5th instance of that course, and we have reached over 1,000 professionals with these capacity building courses. We also launched 2 books with Maria da Penha in schools, and also a book about technical approaches around violence situations. And this book was written by the participants of our program. I'm getting to the end of my presentation. We also had a congress, the first Maria da Penha in Schools Congress in 2017, and in 2019 we had our second congress, and in 2022 we are organizing the third congress. We also had a good practices contest in 2019 to stimulate teachers in the public network to present proposals for discussion and prevention of gender-based violence. And in this contest, we awarded 3 schools. We were also a part of the Maria short film. This professor from Sobradinho, a city in the federal district, elaborated with the student videos about gender-based violence. And this project has the support of the World Bank and the Federal Senate, and is a nationwide contest that wants to encourage students to create videos around those themes, and we have participated in 2 editions of this contest. And then we went into the pandemic, and the pandemic brought a series of restrictions and challenges. And in our program, this was no different. We had to adapt several parts of the program to meet the demands imposed by the pandemic, and considering the difficulties and the vulnerable situations of our population and of people who didn't have access to these technologies and weren't trained to use them, but we were able to, through our time, adapt to the situation. And in 2019, since we had a lot of people to service and our staff wasn't enough, we began selecting volunteer professionals from the network to be multipliers of this program within schools. So we did this in 2019. In 2020, we did a training for these volunteers, and currently we have about 70 people that help us and support us in concentrated actions that need a lot of people to be implemented. And we also implemented the National Day to combat sexual exploitation of children and adolescents, and we do a concentrated effort to discuss this theme within the schools, and we also use these volunteers to support us within this process. We also have a district law that was approved saying that in the month of November, the schools need to debate this theme, and we also concentrate efforts in the month of November to take these discussions to the schools. And ever since, we have developed educational materials, videos, in print material. We have the kit for the education professional. We created a workflow with the schools about the specialized listening of children and adolescents. And throughout the project, we had the need of better structuring the project against violence in relationships. And we also have the National Justice and Peace at Home Week, which was enacted by a resolution of the Justice Council in Brazil. And we have this in March, August, and November. And it's also a time where we actively participate, developing, holding discussions, lectures, workshops within the schools, and taking advantage of the challenges presented by the pandemic. We also held an innovative practices course last year to learn more about how schools were adapting to online education. And this course also awarded the winners, and we also launched a magazine to disseminate the practices that were presented during this contest and the winning practices. In 2022, we had the idea of working in the field and in rural areas, in schools in rural areas around the federal district, and taking this program to these schools. And in March, we held the first in-person training with the managers of rural schools. And from 2022 onwards, we are going to plan for the next stages of the program, considering the realities of the schools and the rural populations. And to conclude, when in the last year, the Ministry of Women, Family, and Human Rights became a part of the program, we had the perspective of replicating this program for other states such as Goiás and Acre, and we had trainings with the professionals from those states, and we trained over 1,600 professionals, and we're now negotiating to expand this to other states that are interested in implementing this program, such as Minas Gerais, Rio de Janeiro, Tocantins, Santa Catarina. But I think my time's up. But I'm also available to answer any questions and to debate with you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Marcos. It's very nice. And the initiatives that you have in the federal district. I had the honor of being there in person and meeting a few of the members of this program. And I think that what we see is a beautiful thing, this initiative that you have that primarily stems from the justice system. And we also have several initiatives by NGOs like Professor Ingrid mentioned. And I think that the biggest shock we have when we look, the biggest commonality we see when we look at Brazil and Australia is that you're filling a gap left by the executive power in Brazil, but in Australia, the executive system is implementing and supporting these initiatives. So if you're already doing all of this without the government support, just imagine what could be done if we had the support so that we could stop losing 4 women a day femicide. So thank you very much.
Eu vou passar a palavra aqui
And
para
now I will pass the floor to Professor Ana Paula Antunes Martins. She's a postdoc researcher in the program of Human Rights and Citizenship in the University of Brasilia. You have the floor, Professor Ana Paula. Good evening and good morning to everyone who's here with us today in this Brazil-Australia dialogues. I would like to greet everyone who's here with us and everyone who's sharing this panel with me, our mediator, Gisela, our organizer, Thiago. They both have a very important role in promoting debates and effective actions for the promotion of alternatives and policies, improvement of policies related to tackling gender-based violence against women and girls. And today I'd like to contribute to this discussion around the educational policies to prevent gender-based violence against women and girls by talking about a dimension of the phenomenon of violence against women within an educational or school perspective, which is violence perpetrated against young people in higher education. We have experienced in Brazil phenomena that of a worsening of violence within universities. And this phenomenon can be explained by a series of factors. When we talk about violence against women, when we talk about gender-based violence, we're talking about a complex phenomenon that has multiple causes and that is very persistent. And this phenomenon can be explained by a variety of factors, one of it which is our structural inequality that we experience in Brazil and that can be explained by factors such as racism, misogyny, and LGBT phobia and transphobia, and specifically transphobia, and I will explain why I'm highlighting this. These inequality factors contribute to the very high rates that Brazil has when we talk about violence against women and girls. When in Brazil we tried to combat one of our biggest sources of inequality, which is access, which is the unequal access to higher education and universities, because our universities up until the beginning of this century was highly elitist and white, and not only majorly white, but almost entirely white. We tried in the beginning of this century to develop policies to tackle these inequalities through affirmative action policies, such as having quotas for indigenous people, for Black people, and for people with lower income rates to access university. And here in Brazil, the universities like to have autonomy to decide on the percentages for these quotas, but there is a federal law that regulates and provides for this affirmative policy, and this was the object of an action at the Supreme Court that deemed this policy as constitutional. But what happens is, in these 20 years of implementation of these affirmative policies, we saw a huge change in the makeup of our students, but we haven't experienced this expressive change in the makeup of in the composition of our professors. And this tends to change if we implement affirmative policies in the postgraduate courses. And in the University of Brasilia, where I teach and do my research, we have had, ever since 2003, a well-established quota policy. And ever since 2020, this policy has been implemented for graduate courses. And since the Brazilian society is deeply unequal, and since our social problems are highly complex, both in Brazil and in Australia, and since gender-based violence is a persistent phenomenon that has multiple causes, we have experienced very harshly, perhaps as a consequence of this quotas policy and the increased diversity within our universities, a phenomenon which is the increased violence within universities, because the university is not a separate world. It is grounded on society, and to a certain measure, it reproduces the unequal standards that exist in society. So we have had an effort by researchers to make these types of violence more visible, and we have also implemented actions to combat violence in higher education. And this might seem too specific, but it is very much related to policies to combat inequality and about the mechanisms developed by society to combat the glass ceiling phenomenon that explains the reasons why even when women and Black women and trans women and indigenous women are able to overcome a few barriers, such as accessing the labor market,
the insertion in mostly male-dominated spaces, and even when they can bring down barriers, there are inequalities that persist, such as the maintenance of salary inequalities that are quite, once again, persistent, and that is explained by the violences, by the girls and the youth, the young girls see throughout their processes, even in higher education, where we think that some of the values are more settled or more existing, which is not true. On that sense, we have done a survey here at the University of Brasilia, a survey that was coordinated by soon emeritus professor of the University of Brasilia, tenure professor of Professor Bandeira, and unfortunately she passed away in September of 2021. She was a professor of the Department of Sociology. She was my doctorate counselor. She invited me in 2017 to follow her and to coordinate with her a survey on harassment and violence at the university. And she has decided to do so due to a femicide that took place within the very campus of the university, or main campus of the University of Brasilia, a femicide that had as victim a student of the biology course. And there was a love relationship between the victim and the perpetrator, and due to a rejection in the relationship, and of course the structuring violence and misogyny, she was murdered inside the lab of the Department of Biology. which is quite symbolic of the resistance, the cultural resistance even, of the gender-based violence. And so from that murder, from that femicide, a series of policies arose and were deepened, were improved. And among those, researches and surveys to see violence in the university context. And just FYI, the University of Brasilia is one of the best universities in the country, and it is in the 7th place of the national ranking of the best universities, and it is in the 4.4 best universities in the world. And that's within that excellent university that this femicide took place. And within that university, that according to the data of our survey that interviewed 827 women, young women, during that period, at the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, which corresponded to 5% of the total women enrolled in the second semester of 2017. So it was a very representative survey that we did. And in that survey, we could notice that 34.46% of the young women, of the students, female students, they lived situations of violence within the university, including psychological violence, sexual violence, and the harassment that are still as one of the main causes of the absence or the school evasion and the dropout, and the inexistence of careers. And we're not even talking about other types of violence like rapes or femicides. Out of the people interviewed, 25%, so 1/4, lived situations of violence around the campus or in the path to the university, which also calls our attention for the need of developing cross-cutting policies. The cross-cutting policies, while we're talking about the urgency of incorporating perspectives, there are anti-racist or anti-sexist in all public policies. So, see, well, when we talk about an educational policy of good quality in affirmative actions and the quota policy, we must talk about the mechanisms to tackle gender-based violence. And if we're going to have more Black people at the university, how will we tackle gender-based violence against this Black women? Because we know they are the biggest victims, much more than the white women. So if we're going to incorporate trans people in the affirmative actions, and some affirmative actions in Brazil, they establish percentages and quota for transsexuals, such as the Federal University of the South of Bahia. If we have affirmative actions for these groups, the marginalized groups that are by transphobe processes, structurally transphobe, especially now, as Ingrid quite well mentioned, Brazil lives a rise in institutional violence. So it's not only omission, it is a matter of a policy directed to the increase and enhance the discrimination against marginalized people. So let's try and incorporate these people to the university. And how, if we're doing that, how we're going to face gender equality, how will we tackle the mechanisms of exhaustion of this group, so, and how and which policies are these? And just in sum, to close, I want to say that the profile of our Brazilian universities has changed. We have faced inequalities in the higher education. For instance, and in this survey, we noticed that over 41% of the women were Black. So there is a presence, a, a, a large presence of the Black population at the university. 20% of the ones uh, that were interviewed there bisexuals or lesbians. So it shows the diversity within that university. But there is a very expressive percentage of harassment. The University of Brasilia has as one of its initiatives the creation of a diversity board. So this was created in 2013 that has as purpose the creation of public policies and the development of actions, debates, proposals of improvement to tackle this type of violence. But and as we're going to act towards the development of educational policies in the higher education that has such an important role to overcome the structural inequalities of our societies. I'm sharing here the link of the book that has been published, where you see the data that I have just mentioned, and also the experiences from all Latin America, different researchers talking about different countries of Latin America on harassment and violence at the universities. So this book is being translated to English, and as soon as we have this edition, which will probably open access, we will share with our colleagues here. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Professor Ana Paula, who brought this perspective in parallel to the higher education, which is so important for all of us. And here in Australia, we seed of developing programs and campaigns within the universities. So we have many links to that. So in a minute, I'll invite Maria Eduarda from ONU Women, and I just want to bring a couple of points for the ones that have presented. Just start thinking about recommendations or questions for the other participants. From my notes here as recommendation, and correct me if I'm wrong, okay? But Professor Helen, she talked about the importance of the inclusion of this theme of gender-based violence in the curricula of the schools, and the challenge, which is the lack of time, and how to include topic within the schools. And also the students highlighted that for them, it was important to talk about the effects of gender-based violence and human rights in schools. And I believe that in the Maria da Penha, well, we see that this theme to be discussed together with racial education, although it's not implemented as it should. Maria Delaney talked about the importance of having that in the curriculum and training of professors and teachers that have not been taught on this topic, which goes together with what Marcos has mentioned, the work of Maria da Penha at schools, shows and teaching the teachers and the principals and how it reaches other communities away from the urban centers. And here we can extend to different areas of Brazil and communities that are less favored, how to reach the slums, and as well as other areas that we know that the level of violence, it's even more severe. And Professor Ingrid, that has this amazing work on the curriculum, the school curriculum, she talked about the lack of political support towards the implementation of these programs that go together with the question that Dr. Thiago asked, and how to tackle those challenges. We have had to go to the Supreme Court to discuss that and what we can do. Maria Eduarda is with us on the chat, talking about how we can vote different. This is election year for the participants in Australia. In October, we'll have presidential elections. This will be a key moment for us in how we can today, because it is fundamental. I mean, with you, the experts from Brazil and Australia, So it's important to make recommendations for the people who are in political campaigns to adopt these policies in their program, their campaigns, and if they're voted in, to implement that, because that's what we need right now in Brazil. And that's why I'm asking everybody that was here or that presented here to make recommendations. This will be very important. I believe along general lines, that's what it is. So think about questions and recommendations. And now I'll pass the floor to Maria Eduarda Dantas. She's from ONU Mulheres or ONU Women. So Maria Eduarda, would be great to hear you and to have the participants of Brazil and Australia. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gisela. Well, if you allow me, before starting, I just want to make a correction, because as Dr. Tiago has told me, this will be recorded and will be shown on YouTube and will be made available for the participants. So this comment was Marcia, okay? I apologize, okay? Yeah. Just didn't give the due credit. Marcia, I'm sorry. So I want to thank you for the invitation on behalf of UN Women and for this possibility of dialogue and cooperation between Brazil and Australia in this theme of domestic violence against women and girls. It's a great pleasure to be here. UN Women is the United Nations entity that works to promote gender equality and empowerment of women, and I'm a specialist in human rights at UN Women in Brazil, as you know, to eliminate the violence against women and girls is one of the areas, the scope of the, so both to respond, we work in the response and the prevention as well to this violence, and education being that in formal or informal areas, it is a strategy of preventing violence. And we say that, well, it means it's twofold. Well, so it's to guarantee that those areas are safe, are free from violence and discrimination against women, girls, and everybody affected by the gender constructions in our society, in all its diversity. So, in other words, to say that everybody should have full access to education. And on the other hand, it means to see the schools and the environments and the learning areas, being formal or informal, as spaces of transformations of unequal relations and empowerment of these people that the human rights are violated. So I just wanted to bring three provocations or three comments, what was brought by or three panelists, and they're inspired by learning experiences we've had with the UN Women in projects to prevent violence against women and girls. So the first one that I wanted to bring you, and it came up in the interventions, is to share that education is not only content, it's not only transfer of skills. We need a lot more for education and educational policies to have this transforming effect for the promotion of gender equality and the prevention of violence against women. So we need safe spaces, we need bonds, we need strengthening networks, and this is not something simple. And this is an aspect that is indeed complex, that is being neglected when you talk about programs, initiatives, and projects in this area. So thinking about the education secretariats and the education professionals that may be with us today, I want to hear a bit more about what is necessary and what do you see as important to see that those programs are comprehensive and efficient for education, for gender education, because that goes much beyond curriculum. There is a whole area that needs for that to work. So this is my first question, my first reflection. And the second one that talks about the different complexity of these programs and initiatives, that talks about this theme that came up in Maria's and Ingrid's presentation and Paula as well, which is the cross-cutting teams. Well, we know women and girls, they're not a homogeneous group. So the forms of violence they face and the adequate strategies to try and protect these girls and women, they must be informed by the gender issues, the race, sexual identity, territory, and so many others. So we can't talk about tackling violence against women in the schools, in the educational areas, if we don't, without talking about the policies against racism, gender discrimination, quota policies that was seen here, and even the guarantee of access of indigenous people to specialized education and culturally appropriated. So I'd like to hear a bit more and to help us understand in practice, in concretely, how those intersectorial policies, how much we miss that to education. How can we advance and develop this integrated, holistic view as we were talking about? And a third point that, and I'll stop here, and talking about what Ingrid and Ana Paula have brought in the research of the University of Brasilia. So we're talking about researchers and students in what they have developed. They have developed initiatives to tackle violence against women and girls and to promote gender equality, ethnicity in educational areas, because they have found barriers, threats, defamation campaigns and assessment, criminalization. So what you, who are very experienced professionals and are acting in this field, what could you share with us for the people who are advocates of human rights in education that may be with us? What resources, what strategies you see that make the difference for these people to move on or to continue with actions? So I have 3 points brought, and I'm very curious and excited to hear you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Maria Eduarda. I wrote a few things down, but please correct me if I'm wrong. But perhaps we could start with Professor Helen about this perspective of education not being only the transferring of knowledge and a matter of curriculum, because Professor Helen is a leader here in International Australia, and she has developed several partnerships with the government and other institutions to develop programs. So I think she can perhaps talk a little bit about how we can build strong networks to implement and promote change. And from the Brazilian side, perhaps Marcos would be an appropriate person to talk about this, since he has built this entire network in Brasilia. So 2-3 minutes for each of you. I know it's a short time, but if we could perhaps answer the 3 questions asked by Maria Eduarda first. Professor Helen, please.
Thank you for wonderful questions. Yes, it's not just about content knowledge, though content knowledge is important to raise awareness around the prevalence of different forms of violence. So children and teachers and young people do need to know what's happening in their country, what's happening in the world. But that knowledge of the prevalence of violence is not enough on its own. So in the school system, we find that students themselves, they want to know how. How do I have good relationships that show respect? Whether the difference is race, age, gender, ethnicity, abilities, anything. So the notion of human rights, or the right of respect for all, regardless of difference, is the ethics that underpins the work. But to carry that ethics into everyday action is the challenge of how. And the same is for the teachers, is the question of how, because they're familiar with methods of teaching and learning that center on content knowledge, not on the skills of living your knowledge in everyday life. So the teachers themselves have to learn what we call transformative methods where the students are working in their groups, practicing the skills of inclusion in the classroom, mixing in small groups, male and female mixed together, looking at small scenarios. What could we do to prevent this situation? What could we do to intervene in a positive way? So it's very practical, applied learning. And it's the same set of skills for intervening with racism, any form of violence. But underneath it all, we're teaching the philosophy of respect and equality. And what we also know from wider research in schools is that if we teach the core capabilities of social and emotional learning, we can build those into every one of these areas. And we then find that most young people don't want to be violent, but they're not sure what to do when they hear negative peer talk condoning violence. They're not sure how to find the collective support of the bystanders together. They're not sure that if they speak up, they will be supported by their peers. They're not sure if they speak up, they'll be supported by their teachers. So if we have the teachers clearly messaging what they will do to support, and the children learning together, and the young people learning together, how could we as a peer group change this pattern? So we empower them through transformative education, but it isn't quick work. We need enough time to do this kind of profound work. And at the whole school or whole university level, we need a long time to change policy and get it to trickle through into action. 3 to 5 years often it takes to get whole of institution change for anything, let alone something as sensitive as this.
Muito obrigada, professora Helen.
Thank you so much, Professor Helen, for your comments. I will now invite Professor Marcos to make his comments about his experience in Brazil. Well, I will take a little bit of what Professor Helen said and talk about the experience that I had when initially developing the project. The first thing we thought was that it was no use for us to go to school and then give a lecture and then leave, because the building of bonds between the networks and us representatives of the justice system and it has to be something that is subjective and in person. And it was important to work not only with the teachers, but with the entire school community to so that they also implement these discussions, because we know we have the patriarchy culture here in Brazil is very pervasive, and this is no different in schools. So when we went to school and started having contact with the teachers, we wanted to create a sense of self-criticism in the teachers so that they could identify to what extent they themselves reproduce sexism, because we know that the schools can both be a space for deconstruction, but it can also be a space for the reproduction of stereotypes. So our first challenge was working with the teachers so that they can identify within themselves their own preconceived beliefs that may be sexist, so that they can have the potential of working this in a meaningful way with their students. And what's more challenging for us here in the Federal District, we're talking about over 680 schools and over 40,000 education professionals and over 525,000 students. So it would be very pretentious of us to think that with the resources we have and with the partners we have, we would be able to reach this entire universe and population. So perhaps I brought a very optimist overview, but we still face many challenges. And I resonated, what Professor Helen said resonated with me when she talked about the challenges faced when working with gender-based violence with the students. And some of the challenges she talked about are similar to the ones we have here. And another thing that's important is the fact that we don't yet have investment, are still very incipient. We don't have, for example, here in the federal district, a public policy that is geared towards prevention, even though the national policy for combating gender-based violence establishes as one of its approaches working with prevention to combat these sexist standards. We still are underdeveloped because we don't have enough funding. So in Australia, this seems to have much more support in terms of resources. And here we are still having trouble in reaching the higher courts because of lack of funding. And the strategies that I would suggest is action, because this project began very small and it grew and grew, and we're having new actions and new projects. We can't stop because I believe that there's no turning back. And even though we have this current administration that is very conservative, we need to keep on resisting. And we bring this gender-based discussion to schools, and we're often faced with people saying this is gender ideology, and we felt that some teachers were resistant to addressing these issues, even though there was a resolution from our education council here in the state saying that this should be discussed within schools and within the school curriculum. So what we do is that with the teachers, we're talking about over 40,000 education professionals. We're trying to first get them to identify their own biases, and then get them to be the math teachers, Portuguese teachers, or whatever, to incorporate these discussions. For example, a history teacher, let's talk about women's history in Brazil, and biology, talking about sex and gender. The Portuguese professor can talk about the gendered Portuguese language, and we have worked this very practically with the teachers according to the demands they bring us. Thank you so much, Marcus. Thank you for your comments about what you have done towards building partnerships and implementing the program. And you also talked about the challenges, which already answers a question that was asked in the chat by Milena Calazans about what are the main challenges and obstacles. This conservative resistance may be one of them. And now addressing the second comment made by Maria Eduarda, perhaps it would be interesting to hear from Maria Delaine and Professor Ingrid about the development initiatives within perspectives of gender and race, and how can we build this intersectional vision. So each of you will have 2 minutes to comment on this. And please go ahead. Can you begin, Maria Delaney?
Yes, thank you for the question. So I'll refer back to the intersectional framework, which guides the work that we do for violence prevention here in Australia. So understanding that gender is a key driver, however, there are many other minority groups. The intersection of violence is exacerbated by the existent disadvantage and the violence they experience, and the intersections with race, sexuality, age, and so forth. So I think coming from a broader social justice perspective in education, looking not only at gender, but all of the other areas of justice and inequity as a broader curriculum, and locating gender as a significant factor within that is key. It also speaks to the diversity within the groups and communities we're working with. So of course, if you enter a classroom or a workshop and present an argument that sounds like we're shaming or blaming men as a whole, as a body, as a homogenous group, then of course you're going to get backlash. So we find the best approach is to talk more broadly about justice, about respect and equity, as Helen mentioned, looking at the different disadvantages for different groups, and including the intersecting disadvantages, for example, of poverty and indigeneity for men. So we know that the Aboriginal men, for example, are highly disadvantaged in Australia, migrant, refugee populations and so forth. So looking at more broadly society and inequity, and doing that with an approach that's kind of akin to personal development or even a spiritual development exercise, where a lot of the work I've done with teachers over time and in schools that have been very successful, it has a really good grounding of a community approach that's very mindful, with practices that are kind of mindful practices, that are practices of connecting with each other, showing compassion, developing empathy, and being able to manage our own emotions through different techniques, so that we'll be able to sustain an uncomfortable conversation where we're feeling challenged and we need courage, and we want to feel motivated and motivate others. So very much around the emotions that come up in change and managing that in the context of challenging conversations where we might be triggered by feeling shamed or blamed, but you know, maybe we feel we've been disadvantaged and subject to violence as well. So a lot of, I think I really like the notion of unconditional positive regard as something to cultivate in all contexts when we're doing this work, and being really mindful around not exciting resistance or a sense of anyone feeling blamed in doing this work. So that's
Muito obrigada, Maria.
Thank you so much, Maria, for your contribution. Professor Ingrid, if you could please talk very briefly about how we can develop this intersectional vision mentioned by Maria Eduarda, and touching on this intersectionality. And very briefly, since our participants and also Marcus have already touched on how to get around the obstacles and how to resist them, if you can also talk about this, it would be great. I wrote a few things down that I wanted to say to conclude my presentation, and also along the lines of making recommendations. I think it's important to recommend the importance of saying and defining what gender is, even if in practice we can substitute the word gender in your text. Even the legal interpretation in the UN, many texts mention sex and not gender, but the word may be interpreted in the context as gender. And in the legal system, this also happens. And even if this happens, defining gender is still very important. We still need to be very adamant about this, and we cannot focus on biology when talking about gender relations. So we still need to say this. We still need to talk about this, and accountability around the prevention of violence, and at all government levels and all administrative levels. So it's not just about a certain administration at the federal level, but the state level, the justice system, I think accountability is a very important aspect. And also there is a very sensitive point working with gender in schools. And this is not news, but this sensitivity was very related to the health theme. And this theme also used to reach the schools um, from a health perspective. So addressing this from a human rights perspective is still a very new notion here in Brazil. And I also would like to talk about the workbooks that are and the material that is used in the schools. How can we work with these themes in the to say that out of all of this, there are two things that are very new and challenging, which is online schooling, which is currently being debated in Brazil, and the militarization of schools. And when talking about the intersectionality, what Maria Eduarda brought is actually there are no right ways to do this. We need to look at the context and be very grounded and look at the place we're at and who we're talking to decide what tools we're going to use. And that's what she meant, I guess. For example, we have inequalities among women, not only the difference between white and black women, but also among white women, we have white women that have differences. And that's what I think she was talking about. So a decolonial education will stem from the place where you're at, where you come from, so as to have a few baseline agreements and recognize some shared boundaries within the same perspective that is shared in that context. And this is also about knowledge, and it will be impactful to the curriculum we're trying to build. So I was just trying to translate my thoughts within this decolonial perspective. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada, professora Ingrid.
Thank you, Professor Ingrid. I'll pass the floor just to close to Professor Ana Paula to reply to the provocation. Then we're going to close this event because we're over our time. Thank you, Gisela. And I'd like to thank Maria Eduarda for her provocations and questions that need to be our challenge to think, well, from global perspectives that are the human rights perspective that are in the treaties, international conventions, that are very important support in contexts of advances of an extreme right wing that has no interest in inequality, and the maintenance of these agreements that have been brought in other political contexts, the treaties and conventions that provide the necessary support for the persistence, for the permanence of policies and actions in the national states, even if they're not government policies. And I must say that in this role, well, governance, different from governability, well, governance, which is a concept that brings visibility and allows different actors, different players with different responsibilities, such as the public defenders, the international organisms, the multilateral organizations, then NGOs, and may reach in those global guidelines towards the human rights, although the government policies are not properly agreeing with those guidelines. These are the big challenges of our democracy. Adam Zavorsky, important political scientist, has published there was the Crisis in Democracy, his book, he published that book. And he said that the Brazilian democracy goes through threats similarly to the democracy of different countries in the world, as it was the recent experience with Donald Trump in the United States, and there are setbacks in terms of rights, but these threats do not mean the ruin of our democratic institutions. Our democratic institutions, they still exist, they still stand, and the existence of this governance led by players such as the judiciary power, the UN Women in Brazil, and universities, they still resist in their perspective, in the democratic perspective, in a Republican perspective towards human rights and the human rights of women and girls, and overcoming our main inequalities such as racism, gender-based violence, and the violence against indigenous and regional populations. So along general lines, I'm very happy that we are under this articulation of the Global South. Australia is in the same axle such as Brazil, and we can strengthen our initiatives. Thank you for this organization, my dear Tiago Piramon, and for the work of Gisela Ferreira in the mediation. So I send you my best for the members of this panel. Thank you. Thank you. I'll pass the floor to Maria Eduarda from UN Women First to close this panel. Thank you, Gisela. It is an honor to have the responsibility of closing this dialogue. I believe we were able to identify issues that are common threats that we see in Brazil, as well as in Australia, and the differences that we have in the context and the conditions for the action of each of them. So I'd like to thank you very much for the invitation. I'd like to congratulate once again our panelists, and I'd say that UN Women is still at your disposal to cooperate and work jointly to tackle the violence against women and girls. Thank you. Good morning for Australia. Good evening for the ones in Brazil. Thank you.
Abraço a todas e todos. Muito obrigado.
I send you all my best. Thank you very much for you. Have a great night in Brazil. Have a great day in Australia.
Encerraram a gravação?
Encerramos, doutor.
Obrigado. So I'd like again to... já foram? Já. Então foram. Obrigado aí, Gisela, Marcos, Ana Paula, Ingrid. Obrigado aí pela parceria de vocês nesse evento. Acho que as discussões foram muito bacanas. E eu anotei muitos pontos aqui. Depois eu vou compartilhar com vocês para ver se a gente está indo aí no sentido correto de compilar as melhores recomendações daquilo que foi mais interessante dessa discussão, para a gente não perder e se levar adiante. Obrigado a todo mundo aí.
Ô, Tiago, a gravação vai ficar disponibilizada? Como é que é?
Isso, aí depois a equipe da Secor vai alimentar lá no YouTube o evento, vai estar em português e inglês.
Tá.
E aí eu passo para todo mundo que participou aqui do painel com o nosso evento.
Quero aproveitar e agradecer também. Boa noite para todos.
Obrigada, gente. Até mais.
Tchau, boa noite.
Discussão. Obrigado à equipe da tradução.
Obrigada.
A equipe da Secor, que deu super apoio. Abraço. Tchau, tchau.
Tchau, tchau.
Tchau, tchau. Boa noite.